Hi, I'm Kristen Amdahl. Today I'm going to show you how to make one of the easiest knitting patterns I've ever designed. It's making a hat with bulky yarn and a size 13 needle. You can either learn how to do it in rows if you're a true beginner, or at the end of the video I'll show you how to do it in rounds for no sewing. Let's get started. For today's quick and simple hat, we're going to use bulky weight yarn and a size 13 or 9mm set of knitting needles. I'm using circulars. To work in rows, you don't need them. You could work this on regular straights. But if you're going to work in the round eventually, which is an easier way in the long run of making hats because there's no sewing, a 16-inch circular is perfect. When most hats are around 20 inches circumference, a 16-inch circular can easily accommodate all the stitches. So just for advance notice, a 16-inch circular is perfect for hats. We're going to not need the circular for this particular demonstration. We're going to work in rows. And what we're going to do is do a long tail cast on, and that means you take a length of yarn, wrap it around your fingers on your left hand. You're going to insert your right hand index finger through the loop made on your left hand and pull the tail through and pull it snug and slide it onto your needle. That slip knot counts as our first cast on stitch. We're going to hold our tail yarn in front and our working yarn in back, and we're going to cast on by wrapping the yarn around the thumb, inserting the needle into the loop made on the thumb, pulling the working yarn through that loop and up onto the needle. That cast on stitch now counts as our second stitch. For this demonstration, I'm going to show you a total of 10 stitches, but what I'd like you to do is cast on 44 stitches. But I'm going to do this nice and slow so you can follow along. A rule of thumb is to mark where you're going to start is to use 3 times the length of what you need. Two, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I've got my 10 cast on stitches done. I'm going to turn my work, and for this hat we're working in 1 by 1 ribbing, and what that means is we knit 1, purl 1, and that's our pattern. Knit 1 with yarn in back, move the yarn to the front, and purl 1. So to just slow that down, what I'm going to show you is we move the yarn to the back, we insert our needle from the left to the right in the front of the stitch, and knit 1. Then we move the yarn to the front, work from right to left in the front of the stitch, and purl 1. Yarn in back, knit 1, yarn in front, purl 1. Yarn in back, knit 1, yarn in front, purl 1. And that's exactly what you're going to do for every row for the first 8 inches of this hat. I'm going to do that another row to show you, and I'm just going to go nice and slow so you can follow along. Knit 1, purl 1. Knit 1, purl 1. The beauty of working with bulky weight yarn, well, there's a couple of benefits to it. First of all, it's quick. Second of all, it's warm. But third of all, as a beginner, it's a great way to start to recognize the anatomy of your stitches. I'll show you on the next row when we turn our work. If you get caught up in the middle of this pattern and you're not sure, oh, darn, did I just do a knit stitch? Did I just do a purl? Where am I? It's really easy to see in ribbing which stitch you do when. You're going to knit the stitches that look like knit and purl the stitches that look like purl. What do I mean by that? This, with the V facing you, that's a knit facing stitch. The one with the bump, that's a purl facing stitch. So however the stitch presents itself to you is how you're going to work it. This is a V, we're going to knit it. This is a bump, we're going to purl it. This is a V, we're going to knit it. This is a bump, we're going to purl it. And it's really just that easy. Every row is knit 1, purl 1, and repeat to end. So now for homework, what I'd like to ask you to do is to please cast on 44 stitches, work rows of knit 1, purl 1 across until you reach 8 inches, and then I'll show you how to decrease for the crown and sew up the seam and finish your hat. All right, just to recap, we cast on 44 stitches with long tail cast on, and we knit in knit 1, purl 1 ribbing for, drum roll, for 8 inches. The reason we work for 8 inches and not a little bit shorter is because we're going to do a really concentrated crown on this pattern. If you were going to do a more complicated pattern, you would do several rows of decreases. But what I wanted to do was make this as easy as possible for a beginner. So because we're going to concentrate all our decreases on 2 decrease rounds instead of a whole bunch, we do the majority of our hat work even. So you want to work 8 inches even, and then what we're going to do is knit 2 together across the entire row. So what you're going to do is insert your right hand needle into 2 stitches from the front, yarn over your needle, pull through both stitches. So you're knitting 2 stitches together at the very same time, and we're going to do this across the entire row. And because we're now working in knitting instead of purling on every stitch, what we're going to do is make the rest of the hat in stockinette instead of a knit 1, purl 1 rib, meaning we're going to knit 2 together across this entire row, turning our 44 stitches into 22 stitches. And then on the opposite rows, or the wrong side rows, we're going to purl across. If you're having trouble getting into both stitches, I find it's very helpful to pull on the work with your thumb and first finger in your left hand. Just give a little tug on the work and see how it elongates the stitches that are on your needle. It gives you a little more wiggle room for sticking your right hand needle into those stitches to knit them. And as long as you're firm but not rough, you're not going to damage your yarn. Okay, so now we've taken 44 stitches and we've turned it into 22 stitches. We're now going to turn our work and we're going to purl across the whole row. And that's with the yarn in front. Okay, so now we've done a decrease row and now we've done a purl row. We're going to do one more decrease row, and that's going to be knit 2 together across the whole row. So we're going to knit 2 together, starting on the left, insert your needle into the next 2 stitches and knit them together. Because we're working this hat in rows and not rounds, we're going to have to sew up the side seam. And in order to do that the most efficiently, what I like to do is make sure that when I fasten off, I leave my tail long enough for using the actual tail for doing the sewing. So we're going to do one more purl round, or purl row, the yarn in front, and after this row we're now going to cut our yarn, and I'll show you what we do then. Okay, so actually before we cut our yarn, what we're going to do is pull each of the remaining stitches up and over the last stitch on our needle. It's a little different than binding off, and it gives us a nice concentrated little like starburst at the top of the hat. Okay, and then we're going to cut our yarn, but again we're going to make a really long tail so we have plenty of yarn for sewing. Okay, and then we'll fasten off that last stitch. Like that. See how that type of bind off really gives us a nice starburst at the top? So now we're going to grab our yarn needle, and with bulky yarn you really do need to have the right size needle. If you tried to do this on a regular yarn needle, you would want to pull your hair out. Make sure you get one that has a large enough eye that you can actually fit bulky yarn through it. Okay, and so now we want to line up. See how you can see where our decreases began? So we want to make sure we line up everything properly and make sure that we're sewing to the right area on both sides of our work. And what I do is just insert my needle from the front, or from the right side, down and back up. Try to grab 2 threads or 2 bars of the yarn. The most important thing is to be consistent on both sides so you're not speeding ahead on one side and not enough on the other, because you'll get uneven ends. And if you're new to this, you know, sometimes you have to do things once or twice to get the hang of it. But if you keep a good tally of how far along you are on both sides, like for example, like when I showed you the reference point of where that corner was, where the decreases start, that's a good reference point to make sure that you're working evenly spaced on both sides. Now we're going to double check again that they're both the same length, which they are. So I can now start working in the rows section where there weren't decreases. And what I like to do is work into the side of the last stitch at the end of each row and grab 2 horizontal bars. Or about, for this case, about a little under 1/2 inch. And as you go, make sure that they both look about the same length. If not, you could adjust. If they're too far off, you could always end up pulling it back out and starting over. Nothing wrong with that. You want it to look right. It's easier to pull out and start over than it is to try to readjust an edge that looks like that. So keeping a nice tally of how even your ends are as you go is a great way to avoid making that mistake. And of course, if you're off by just a smidge, you can definitely adjust for that. It's just if you're off by more than 1/2 inch, that's when it can get not worth trying to fix. And it looks like I'm pretty close. And then when it comes to sewing up the final edge here, we will end up putting in a knot to secure it. And I'm going to do it a second time just to make sure that it's secure. Knotting from one side to the other, and I'm going to turn my work over now to weave in the ends. The beauty of that kind of a joint is that it gives you a nice solid edge or seam on the inside, and it's a great place to weave in your ends. The most important part about weaving in ends is to make sure that you go in multiple directions. The more you twist and turn, the less likely it is to wiggle itself back out through wear and washing. And I wouldn't weave in less than 3 inches. The more you weave in, the more secure it is. There we go, that one's done, and then we'll weave in our beginning tail. Now, I'm not impressed with my beginning tail, I have to say. I would suggest that you make a longer beginning tail than this, just because it is difficult to weave in short ends. More is better. Okay, and there is our 1x1 ribbed bulky knit hat worked in rows. Next up, I'll show you how to do it in the round. It's very simple to convert this hat, the one that I did in rows, into working in rounds where you don't have to do the sewing at the end. You're still going to need bulky weight yarn, size 13 or 9mm knitting needles, only this time we're going to use 16-inch circulars. It can also be done on double points, it can also be done on magic loop with larger needles. This is by far the easiest way I found to do it and the one that I enjoy the most. So I've once again cast on 44 stitches, only this time, instead of working back and forth in rows, I'm going to work continuously in a spiral pretty much. I'm going to work around and around and around, and I'm going to show you how you get started on that. This would also be a way to make a cowl if you weren't going to do the decreases for the crown. You could just do the even rows and make a beautiful cowl. So what we're going to do is, well, first of all, we cast on 44 stitches, and then I want to stretch my stitches evenly around so that I have stitches at the point of both of my needles. And what you want to do is start with knit one, purl one, and work that all the way around. Although I find a great tip for when you are joining is take that last stitch worked, slip it over to the first stitch worked, and knit those 2 stitches together. But because we need to accommodate for that extra stitch, we're now going to purl those stitches together as well. And then place them on the right hand needle, and we now have our first 2 stitches worked and a very secure seam in our knitting in the round. So we're going to knit one, purl one, all the way around the 44 stitches. If you were interested, you could put a stitch marker at the beginning of this round so that you could remember where it is. However, the tail is a very handy tool that works as a stitch marker, and because we're doing the exact same thing on every round, it's not that necessary to mark the beginning and the end because we're not going to have to change what we do at the end of every round. Knit one, purl one is extremely easy to do in the round. So is stockinette. Things are done differently in the round versus rows, but we can get into that in other projects when it becomes important. For right now, it's just important to remember, oh, here's a good tip. Because I'm talking, I forgot where I'm at, which definitely happens from time to time in the real world. I'm going to look for those V's and bumps again. I see that that one is a V, so that was a knit. That was a purl because of the bump. This was a knit, so now I remember that it's time to purl. Well, not that I remember, I see the clues. And as you go around, when you're working in the round, especially if you're not that it's snug, but we don't have a ton of extra space, you might just want to slide your stitches as you go. Just kind of give them a little nudge in the right direction. Makes things go a little smoother. And we're just going to knit one, purl one all the way around. At the end of this round, it'll start to become much more apparent of which stitch is which, like when I showed you on the rows where we would recognize the V and the bump. It's going to become a lot more noticeable as we keep going. We're still working into the cast on edge, so it's not as noticeable. Okay, it's getting tight again. When it gets tight, it just means it's time to slide your stitches around a little bit. Oh, the other thing to make sure of is when you're joining them in the round, I should have pointed this out, but now's a good enough time to do it as well. Make sure your stitches are all facing the same direction. You don't want any sort of twist in your stitches when you're joining in the round. Otherwise, you will be creating a Mobius or a twist and not a perfect smooth column. There are times when that's a great design element, and when it's not, it's a disaster. It means you have to start over. So make sure that there's no twist when you're doing a hat or a cowl or a turtleneck or anything else that you don't want to twist in. Okay, so now we've come to the end of our round, and that's, I know, because our tail yarn is sitting right there, and we're just going to continue around in knit one, purl one. And you can see there's the V and the bump, so we know it's a knit one here and a purl one there. So that's the hang of getting the knit one, purl one in the round, which is just slightly different from knit one, purl one in rows. But you can see you end up getting the same look, and you can actually make the same pieces. Now, if you wanted to stop it before the crown, this could end up being a cowl, and you would just bind off evenly, or you would do your decreases the same we did for the hat.